you saw the very best players the entire country has to offer, and you saw it throughout the course of the weekend.
He's growing, he's improving at such a rapid rate. He's going to be a very good player.
This guy's a cross between Sean Marion and Lamar Odom. He's a 6'8" lefty, a high-level athlete, but also got a little bit of point-forward skills in him as he can handle and pass the ball extremely well. At this point, they are simply the standard by which everyone else is judged in prep school basketball. He's considering the likes of Michigan, North Carolina, Kentucky, Kansas.
Welcome back to the latest episode of the Upside Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Finkelstein, and on this week's episode, we have the Vice President of the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, Greg Procino. And Greg, first of all, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Adam. Happy to be with you.
So obviously, as COVID rates continue to rise and the implications continue to be felt on college basketball and in this very atypical college basketball season, Greg, you had the unique opportunity, or burden perhaps, I guess we'll get into that, to run the Hall of Fame's Bubbleville event at Mohegan Sun Arena. And that was 25 teams, and please correct me if I'm mistaken, 25 teams, 26 games in the matter of how many days is that?
Well, it was 11 days worth of games, but it really spread over 13 or 14 days worth of activity.
Gotcha. And this was the evolution of the normal college basketball event that you host at Mohegan Sun, but it's really become my interest in having you on today was to see the logistics that went into that, and then to give the college basketball fans a better understanding of if this is something that's can be replicated if need be for the rest of the season. Obviously, the vaccine, I think the first person actually got vaccinated today. Today's Monday, the 14th, as we're recruiting this. So we're all hoping that there's light at the end of the tunnel, but it's not yet sure if that is going to be during the college basketball season or not. And meanwhile, these rates do continue to rise, and people are hoping to get into college basketball season. I should also say that after the incident at the Florida State game this week, everybody, again, as we record this, we're waiting to see what's happening with Keontae Johnson, what the implications of that will be, if that's COVID related, and what that could do to college basketball. But and obviously everybody is praying for him. But under that context of which we want to understand the logistics of bubbles, because a bubble in college basketball is proving to be very different than the NBA's bubble. So I'm going to start just kind of a wide-ranging question, and then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty as we go here. But take me back to the first moment where you realized, like, hey, in order to run our event or some form of our event, we're going to have to create a bubble-type setting, and what the logistics of that looked like from a macro standpoint initially.
Sure. Well, I mean, the first important point is that a lot of people were waiting on the NCAA to determine the rules of the road for the current season. That decision didn't actually come in until September 15th. So a lot of us that organize these type of events early in the season were kind of holding our breath to see what the NCAA was going to decide in terms of the number of games and the start date of the season. Then secondly, we were all kind of waiting for each conference to decide, their rules of participation. So relatively speaking, with a scheduling process that sometimes takes a year or two in advance to plan, people were left with days and weeks to figure out how they were going to play their games and where. When we started to look at the possibility of Mohegan Sun, we knew a couple things going in. One is that we obviously have 10 years of experience running college basketball games in that venue with their staff and their team. So there was already a comfort zone that we could work hand in hand to produce this type of an event. Secondly, Mohegan Sun had been the site for the Viacom Showtime boxing bubble that started at the end of July, early part of August. So we also knew that their security team, their food and beverage team, their arena team were already used to operating in some form of a bubble for that group. And it's also important to know that Mohegan Sun's got an enormous amount of square footage. So although the property was open for business, we were able to create 4 private zones inside the Mohegan Sun property that were exclusive to our group, that didn't cross paths with public foot traffic, so that when a team wanted to move, we could move them safely into a spot where they could then do whatever they were going to be doing at that time. So, I think there was a couple of variables that played into this creation. One was obviously the timing of the NCAA and the conference decisions. 2, the total scramble for games, and 3/4, the venue that was interested in working with us had some experience in doing this and has some experience with us.
No, there's a number of different tangents of which I could go from here. I think the first one, though, is again, because I think the big theme is, could this be done again? Not necessarily at Mohegan Sun, but it certainly sounds like the NCAA is thinking about doing something like a bubble for the NCAA tournament. They're talking about doing it at one location. The logistics of, let's approach it from a scheduling standpoint first. Obviously, I don't have experience scheduling for college, but I know at the prep school level, the amount that these coaches are focused on their strength of schedule and the probability that they're going to win their games is well beyond what anyone would possibly imagine. And I have to imagine that on the college level, that's only further magnified. Was that easier to deal with this year? Were people less concerned about that because of everything else that was going on? Because, having some sense of a grander perspective, or was it more challenging given the fact that they're probably going to play less games this year than they would in a normal year?
I think for those teams that wound up coming to Bubbleville, there was a way more open mind to being flexible to change. I think a lot of people appreciated the opportunity to compete, get off campus, be in a safe environment, play competitive games. Because a lot of these teams and coaching staffs have been on campus by themselves, rather secluded since the summertime,
right?
Monitoring the COVID virus on within their own team.
Yep.
So for those teams that made it to Bubbleville and participated, the ability to be open-minded about scheduling was way more flexible than it is traditionally. As you mentioned, schedules are normally crucified by the coaching staffs before they reach the administration level. Yeah. But in this scenario, the teams that came really just wanted an opportunity to play, and they were very mindful of the variables that could cause change. Because they've been living it with their own teams and they're on their own campus for months. There were some teams that we expected to have play that didn't wind up making it to Bubbleville. Right. And that's primarily because, they got a little more focused on, the date, the time, the network, and the opponent that we couldn't fix in time to have them.
You had some people opt out because of scheduling, not just because of positive tests.
Correct.
Okay.
And again, I kind of thought we would get to a place where we'd have a schedule and live somewhere close to it. But the reality was that the schedule was changing almost every day at all hours of the day. Villanova scheduled 2 games at 2 a.m. with us.
Yeah,
it just never happens at this level.
Right.
Where they were expecting to go home, and they found out their next opponent had a positive case, canceled their game, and extended their stay. So for those that made it, it was a very much an open mind to let's play some games against somebody, as opposed to analyzing the net impact of a quality win or not.
Now, please, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but just to clarify that statement about Villanova, the game where the opponent had a positive was initially slated to be their first game outside the bubble, correct?
Correct.
So that was not a team inside the bubble. That was a team outside.
Correct. Outside the bubble. Whatever their next they were both games in Philadelphia, I believe.
Gotcha.
As their trip extended, their schedule kept changing to the point where we wound up adding 2 games for them.
Now, this would not be, the question I'm about to ask would not be a factor if conferences have to go into bubble play or if the NCAA tournament has to go into bubble play. But in the non-conference schedule, I imagine it was a huge issue. And so what I'm alluding to is the finances of it, because typically one of the things that I don't think most common fans have an appreciation for is the importance of these guarantee games, or quote unquote buy games, in terms of funding a low to mid-major college basketball program. I mean, the reason why you see low to mid-major programs play 2-3 high major schools a year isn't because they value being on TV enough to probably get blown out, but it's because they're getting literally paid to play that game, and
Sure.
oftentimes paid in the range of $75,000 to $100,000, and that money times maybe three turns out to be a big part of their operating budget for the year. Now, without getting into the specifics of the numbers for Bubbleville, was that an element of the scheduling that had to be, or was this kind of just, hey, if you want to play, we've got games, or was it like, hey, this low major school, if you want to play this high major school, there's some opportunity to get a guarantee type opportunity?
The model for the traditional guarantee games went out the window really when the NCAA changed their scheduling protocols for the season. So already coming into the season, the market for the buy games had significantly lowered anyway.
Right.
A lot of schools at the low and mid major levels are just experiencing an extreme deficit anyway. So the actual impact of a college basketball guarantee in this specific year might not have been as impactful as it would be in a normal year, because everyone's operating at a fraction of their own business. So I think a lot of low major and mid major teams elected to postpone guarantee games a year in exchange for playing just either like-minded and or local games against teams that can make it cost efficient for them to participate in a season. Because if there's going to be a season, it costs something to play.
Right.
But normally where radar is up on the level of guarantee being provided, that wasn't necessarily the case this time around, because one, the market didn't demand that.
Yeah.
But secondly, a lot of schools wind up rescheduling those type of games for future years.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you. And then the logistics of, because the other thing that's interesting about this bubble versus what we saw in the summer down at Disney with the NBA was your bubble was not everybody in at the same time, everybody out at the same time. It was a little bit of a revolving door, but in terms, correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of like, no readmission. Once you leave, you can't come back in kind of, is that accurate?
We actually did have a couple of schools that did return, return in the bubble. But the only way to return was to re-enter under the same protocol as they entered the first time. And just to note, I mean, we spent more time on the medical and safety protocols than we did on the basketball side. The ability to get everyone safely cleared to compete was an enormous undertaking that took an enormous amount of time, and wouldn't have happened without that effort. Because every school and conference had their own protocols in terms of how they were going to play. We had our own protocols that were designed in with the Mohegan Sun Health Department. We had a COVID compliance officer working with every school's athletic trainer and or doctor on their participation. There was, we issued 2,800 tests over the course of 14 days. And that wasn't just to the teams. It was to all of us working staff, ESPN production, scores table, game officials. Everybody had to operate under the same protocol in order to participate or work inside of Bubbleville. And without that effort, combined with the ability to socially distance space and use back of house routes at Mohegan Sun, the games probably don't happen. There wasn't really a lot of time to joke around, but I mean, we got to the point where literally every day we played was a borderline miracle, because we're sitting on pins and needles in the middle of the night waiting for test results to come in. But that was the only way. That was the only way that we were going to play and play safely. And by test results, it wasn't just the teams; it was everybody around the event. Because by the time we're done contact tracing a positive test, we might eliminate people that are essential to it happening and could have crumbled the entire operation.
And you did not have to cancel any games because of a positive test inside the bubble. Is that correct?
We had to cancel the last game on the last day. It was the UConn-NC State men's game. There was a positive test in the NC State travel party.
Before they arrived, though?
No, on site.
Oh, okay.
That we got word back about Friday night at midnight, and the game on Saturday at noon, which was game 27 of 27, did get canceled.
So was there a testing protocol leading up to their arrival in addition to, I mean, I'm sure there had to be, right?
Yeah, everybody was required to submit a negative PCR test result within 72 hours of arrival to Mohegan Sun. Everybody was also required to take a nasal PCR test upon entry to Mohegan Sun. And then we used the PCR Yale saliva direct test that the NBA was involved in,
Oh,
screening test throughout the course of Bubbleville. So that's how we got up to the 2,800 number, because once we got into it and people kind of cleared the initial protocol, we had to routinely test daily to keep people safe, but also to meet the NCAA requirements of a 24-hour test prior to play.
okay. Now I'm gonna get into the weeds a little bit, so if please feel free to tell me we're going too deep here. But I didn't realize you were using the saliva-based Yale rapid response test, and I know when the NBA.
Well, it wasn't a rapid response test.
Okay,
The PCR test through Yale, the saliva, did require lab work.
I see.
It was more efficient because it was a pool test as opposed to a single sample.
Okay.
But it did require lab work. So the 12 to 14-hour turnaround time we were getting from the nasal PCR test was 6 to 8 hours on the saliva PCR test. So it was more efficient.
But it still had to go to a lab.
Result faster.
Yeah, but it still had to be processed by a lab.
Correct.
Gotcha. Is there another test, and this perhaps shows my ignorance on this, but is there another test in the works that I thought the NBA was participating in that is a saliva-based rapid response test that is not yet to market? Is that something you're aware of?
I'm not totally sure.
Gotcha.
I can't give you a great answer there.
Okay.
This test came about over the summertime.
Right.
And we were able to utilize some relationships to help get access to it, and it turned out to be the right choice.
No, I know. So you're in this bubble for 14 days, and I assume no families are there. There's no spouses, no children, no anything.
Nope.
And I know when I reached out to you last week, it was like, hey, reconnecting with family. I'll be back on the, and I'm paraphrasing, but back on the grid next week. What is that like from a mental standpoint? Because I know you're not a coach and you're not with a team, but we've heard quite a bit about the mental health implications on the players and the kids. Should we have to go into a bubble-like situation? Obviously, the NBA players rose those issues somewhat down in Orlando, and they had, and I mean, they had access to more amenities probably than most college players would in a comparable type bubble situation. So is that something that you guys even had an opportunity to assess or contemplate in terms of like the mental health implications?
Well, at the very beginning, we decided that we were not going to open up our window of play for more than a certain period of time for that exact reason.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't believe in an extended stay longer than what we did.
Mm-hmm.
For those staff members that worked the event, frankly, it was such a whirlwind that the days went so fast that although it's very hard to be away from family and friends, the days just flew by because there was constantly something happening at one part of the property or another. From a team perspective, I mean, that's certainly a valid. That's again one of the reasons why we didn't do an extended stay,
right,
past what we did. I don't think. I think there's mixed thoughts there, right? There's one train of thought that that people are just thrilled to be able to play. Like, let's get an opportunity to play. We're going to go somewhere. We normally go places for a week at a time during an early season tournament or a foreign tour. Granted under different circumstances and under different protocol, but there are extended stays that happen over the course of a season. Even look at March Madness or the conference tournaments as another example. The flip side to that, though, is that this was kind of isolation. It was kind of secluded, right? I mean, there was 24/7 hotel security. They didn't walk through the public space. They walked through the loading docks.
And they weren't watching games that they weren't playing in, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
So you really moved from your room to your meal to the arena to practice and then back.
And that was it.
The duration of your stay. one of the coaches summed it up pretty well. It was one of the teams that extended their stay. That their players were prepared for one length of trip, and then it became harder as the stay extended.
Right.
But if we were prepared to stay for a period of time, then we would have been okay with it.
Yeah.
So I think it is a delicate balance. But duration of time it was a big factor for us, that we knew that our window wouldn't last past what it did.
So nobody's taken their I mean, I think that's the biggest difference from what you hear about the NBA guys who are, walking around Disney grounds and complaining about the food in the Grand Floridian or something, is that these players, and you guys have run the most, the most proven model yet, in my opinion. And these college players are basically going from their room to, I believe you said, practice and game, and then that's it. I mean, otherwise they're back in their room for the vast majority of the day, it would seem.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, there were the 4 zones at Mohegan Sun that we used was the arena for games, the expo center for practices, the convention center for testing and food and beverage, and then the hotel towers. Yeah. So the teams were in one of those 4 areas the entire duration of their stay, because we had to limit the exposure to other people that weren't under the same protocol that we were, because
Sure.
we weren't even bulletproof ourselves, let alone interacting with other people that weren't being tested as frequently as our group was.
And are the teams kept separate from each other too? Are they
basically a hotel floor per team?
Wow.
The 24/7 security guard checking credentials.
Wow. Yeah.
That's also partially because the property is open for business too.
Yeah.
So to make sure that the public wasn't accessing a team floor.
Right.
But it was also some peace of mind for coaches too, to know that
I'm sure.
on their floor.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanna ask you about geography, if I could, because obviously that has played a role in how different states and areas of the country have dealt with the virus, from a political standpoint and different avenues off of that. But being in New England and being on an Indian reservation, what were the implications, or being in Connecticut, what were the implications of any of those 3 variables that made it easier or more difficult for you to execute this plan?
Well, Mohegan Sun sits on tribal land, so they have their own health department, their own emergency services group. They do control their own government, if you will. So the decisions about what to do on property are controlled by them. They took an enormous amount of measures to open the property back in June for regular business. So they take the virus and all the protocols extremely seriously, and have actually exceeded CDC guidelines in a number of measures that were put into place just to keep the property open for regular business. So relative to how we navigated those things like travel advisories and permission, if you will, we worked closely with Mohegan Sun because they were on tribal land, and to create a protocol document that could sustain this event in the safest way possible. Because the worst piece of news Mohegan Sun could have out of this is that there was an outbreak on their property that shut the rest of their business down. So we had to take extreme measures with them in order to operate this event in a safe way, and they set the bar very high for us to do this. For example, the property doesn't accept the antigen test, the rapid test. That's not an acceptable form of testing on property. It was either PCR test or nothing, as a form of example.
Yeah, interesting. And are there? And I want to ask this appropriately, but there were other comparable events in different parts of the country where there were what was the protocol if someone tested positive on one of the teams already in the bubble? Would that team have been allowed to play? Was there any scenario in which that team would have been allowed to play, or is it just somebody test positive in the games, that team's done?
It depends on the situation, to be honest with you.
Okay.
If it was a designated tier 1 travel party member, which is essentially your players and your staff, by the time you're done contact tracing, there really isn't a game to be played. so
Logic would seem to dictate that, but not necessarily everywhere.
and it's also, like we weren't going to be the event that cut any corners either. Like if we had a tier 1 positive test, that would have in almost all circumstances eliminated a team. But our approach was to take each case by case basis to determine what the appropriate steps would be to either allow someone to carry forward and participate or not. So there wasn't a black and white policy. It was governed by independent medical people that some didn't care about basketball, which is actually important in this case.
Sure.
If we had a positive test result, we would have a contact trace, an exam, an interview, and that would determine how we were to proceed with that individual team. We did 2,800 tests in 13 days, 14 days. We had 4 positives out of that 2,800 tests. 3 of those positives were upon arrival, entry tests, so they never really entered the bubble.
Right.
The 4th one was the final test for the NC State game the night before they were supposed to play UConn. And at that point, that person was a tier 1 travel party member, and therefore the game couldn't carry forward.
Which is, and I won't be more specific than saying that is not necessarily what we saw at other events around the country. At this,
correct. We were not going to play through that. There's no way to spin that as the right decision in our mind, whether that be from an optics perspective or a safety and health perspective. And one of the things that I think I learned a ton about was the value of the incubation period of the virus.
Sure.
Because just because someone tests negative one day doesn't mean they're not going to test positive the next day. And in that scenario, that person might be carrying the virus and exposing people without testing positive. So one of the things, at least on the top of our list, if the NCAA were to ask us our feedback on this, is that there has to be a quarantine period that would mirror the incubation period of the virus. Because once you have that and then you test the group negative, your chances of staying negative are just so much greater.
Right.
We
and the NBA did that, correct? That's what the NBA did.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we didn't have the time to do that for everybody. We did that for most people, but not everybody. So call it either luck or protocol or both. But we got all the way to the end with only one issue.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the team that had the issue was not able to go through that quarantine period that mirrored the potential incubation period. Is that right?
Correct. So the team in question, the player who eventually tested positive had tested negative in the days prior.
Yeah,
carried the virus with him from home.
Right.
And that's something we didn't wind up avoiding because that particular team didn't have the incubation period that we needed.
And I think I want to underscore this because I think this is important for everybody listening around this time of year. Is there, and I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent here, is they're starting to think about what to do about the holidays. I know in my family we're having this conversation too, and it's like, hey, if we get a test here and we get a second test here, could we still get together? And it was actually, my stance on this was altered recently from friends of mine who are college coaches who had positive tests within their program, who've in some cases been able to trace it back to a single play. I'm not going to say specific teams or names, but there was a friend of mine who has a player test positive. They couldn't figure out where it came from. They ultimately traced it back to a game where he took a charge on someone who had previously tested negative and only tested positive the following day. And the person who took the charge went on to test negative for the following 3 days before only testing positive on the 4th day. But he was, correct me if I'm wrong, and I know you're not a doctor either, and so we should add that caveat. But
no doubt,
theoretically, you're still contagious on those 3 or 4 days before it shows up in the test. Is that the working assumption anyway?
Yeah, and then we learned that along the way from the various medical people that were involved in our side. And for us, like I'm not a doctor, our staff aren't doctors. We had to form an independent medical team that focused on keeping this event safe. And you're right, that's a good example of what could happen, in everyone's normal life.
Yeah.
So we're having similar conversations about our family around Christmas, and that exact situation, that a negative test doesn't mean that you're actually negative, which is part of what makes this a scary virus.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to wrap this up, if you will, with a look at the future of what could come in this college basketball season. Is the Hall of Fame currently planning, or have they currently announced plans for any other college basketball events this year?
No. We've completed our run this year of games.
If someone were, you mentioned before, if the NCAA were to ask you for help based on your experiences here, is this something, if you had to do this again, if someone said to you, and this is obviously very theoretical, but if a conference came to you and said, we're going to need to create a bubble for our conference tournament, we really want to make this happen, we're committed to doing it, but we're committed to doing it safely, pardon me. What would be the big takeaways? It sounds like are not just testing protocol, but also a quarantine going into the bubble. Is that the biggest takeaway?
For sure. Controlled environment, testing protocols, the value of the incubation period, and the value of having an independent medical team surrounding the event to make level-headed decisions. Because walking into this, the health and safety of everybody, including ourselves as staff, was paramount to what happened on the court. And without a group of people that can evaluate the feasibility of this kind of effort, I know we wouldn't have gone forward without that group of people around us.
That seems so important. People who are in no way vested in the outcome of the games, but strictly in the safety of what could potentially happen. And again, I think that has implications beyond sport as well. So now I'm going to ask you to speculate. What do you think the chances are that we see another bubble in this college basketball season?
As of December 14th, I would put it at 75-25, yes.
Yeah, no, I would tend to.
And I think it could be formed in various ways. I think conferences could look at taking their teams to a site for a period of time. I think conferences could look at taking groups of teams to multiple sites for a period of time. And certainly, the NCAA seems like, from all the headlines, has to figure out how to have a tournament economically to carry forward in a meaningful way. So some bigger version of what we did somewhere seems likely, without fans, television studio kind of setup.
Yeah. I've done it. I've done it myself. How many games? Now, you had commentators on site, I know, but I called the game.
We did, but those commentators were 25 feet from the court.
Yeah.
This was not a courtside television setup. This was literally 25 feet off the floor.
So I will tell you this, Greg. I've called 4 games so far this year. One of them has been remote. 3 of them have been on site. The one that was remote, I was in a booth separate from my commentating partner for the day. So we had none of that we were actually Zooming like you and I are now. So we could kind of do that nonverbal cues to get us through the game. And the ones that I was on site for, we were required to wear a mask so we've got the headset and the mic on over the mask. And I was pleasantly surprised that it didn't, dilute the sound quality. But it was, just from that stand. And again, I'm getting into the weeds, but that's, those are things that people don't think about, that all of a sudden you've got to start to contemplate here.
Yeah, no, look, the reality here is that we didn't have a playbook here for this. We didn't have the resources that the NBA had. We had a plan and some experience and some necessary context in order to pull this off. But we we got lucky to get as far as we did, frankly, the way the numbers have been working lately. But we had the right people and the right team, and kind of trusted our experience, and was able to make this happen. But it was no easy task. I think I called it a round the clock roller coaster, which I can't think of a better way to describe it, because literally everybody was on edge for the duration of time.
Well, that's why I wanted to have you on, because you have set the blueprint for how to do it so far this year, but you've done it with the humility to say, hey, this wasn't perfect and it can be better. Because I agree with you. The likelihood that we are going to, the financial reality is that college basketball and college athletics will need the NCAA tournament to happen. But the likelihood that will need to be in some sort of bubble seems to be increasingly high with each passing day and week here, the way the rates are going. And I just think it's so important to learn from what has already been done, and learn from people who have done it successfully, but again, still have the humility to say, hey, you could be even safer than we did it. And because I think that really needs to be the priority. So that was exactly why I wanted to have you on. And I appreciate your candor across the board, and really what you were able to accomplish was an incredible feat that I think will have long lasting implications for the rest of the college basketball season. And ultimately that's going to pay dividends forward, because this is a college basketball season that's going to be crucial to the future of the sport. So thank you for coming on and being willing to talk about it.
No problem, Adam. Anytime. Appreciate the time and the opportunity.
All right, everybody. That is Greg Procino, the Vice President of the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. And one more time, we want to thank him for coming on, his candor and his humility, as I said. And just one final reminder, everybody, as the holidays are coming up, please learn from these lessons. I hope you listen to the stories about the incubation period. Everybody be safe and healthy this holiday season. As always, thanks for listening. I'm Adam Finkelstein.